Okay, so this is the revision session for those of you studying Lords of the Flies. Okay, direct knowledge. You're going to answer one question on Lords of the Flies. Okay, you get a choice of two. You pick one. In section B, you'll answer on power and conflict. One poem will be printed, and you'll compare it to one other poem that you studied from this collection. You don't answer on any other clusters, love and relationships or identities. Okay, then you go to section C. There are two questions on section C. You answer both. You must mention methods, and the second is a priority. So you will answer 4 questions on this exam. 1 on Lord the Flies, the power and conflict comparison, and the 2 unseen questions in section C. Section C looks like that. It says section C on it. So you'll have one unseen poem that's worth 24 marks. You spend 30 minutes on that question. Then you'll have a second unseen poem. Again, it still says section C, unseen poetry. You will write one comparative paragraph that compares the first unseen poem and the second unseen poem. You must mention methods explicitly. We'll have a look at that at the end. Timings. So in section A, spend 45 minutes on the one question that you are choosing on Lord the Flies. 3 or 4 point essay with a thesis opening. There's no extract. Remember, the writer's name is most important. Section B, power and conflict. One poem printed compared to another poem that you've studied. 45 minutes. Write a thesis intro that talks about both poems. Then I'd say roughly 2 analysis paragraphs on the printed poem, then your discourse marker, and then talk about the other poem that you've chosen to compare it to. Remember, keep using your comparative phrases, keep bringing it back. This is unlike in London, or this makes it different to exposure because At the end, have a quick conclusion that summarises both poems. Remember, you don't study love and relationships, so you kind of ignore that. You just on power and conflict. Section C, unseen poetry. 2 unseen poem questions. 1 unseen poem with 1 question, 30 minutes, 3 paragraphs roughly. Second unseen poem where you compare the first unseen poem to the second, 15 minutes, 1 comparison paragraph. You must mention methods. Okay, Lord of the Flies, key contextual ideas. Okay, so these are things that you need to know. Golding was right after the Second World War, in which he was involved. The idea of conflict being everywhere and entrapping life is important. And that's mirrored in the structure of Lord of the Flies. It begins with a plane crash, a dead airman, and ends with a naval officer. You can't get away from conflict. Golding was a teacher at a high-end public school, and he wrote this text as a reaction to kids' adventure stories of the early 20th century. And he considers how children would react, and he's got a key message in this. Okay, wealth and background doesn't make people good. They've still got primal desires. Think about Jack. Key message in this text is man's inhumanity to man. Golding suggests if context allows, we're all capable of being savage, evil, bad people. See that with Jack. Think about the characters of Jack and Ralph. Jack's a choir boy. He's head boy. He's privileged. However, he becomes the most savage person on this island. And that's Golding's ironic message. If he can turn evil, what can any person do? Okay, Ralph's the golden boy, fair-haired boy at the beginning. Okay, he's attached to Conch. However, in chapter 7, even he gives into bloodlust. You know, when he tries to kill the pig, I hit him. Okay. And, that quotation, the desire to squeeze, was overmastering. There's a sense that nobody's safe from primal desire. So there's a few key symbols that you need to know. The first one's obviously the conch. Okay, the conch represents order and the beauty but fragility of order. Piggy's the person who first realizes that this conch is really precious. Okay. He can be seen as, I would describe him as the father of civility. At the beginning, the conch is creamy white and it's glimmering. The idea that it's got real value on this island. Both Piggy and Ralph cradle the conch or caress it at different parts. To cradle it is what a father does to a child, okay? Piggy and Ralph both try to protect it, and they love the idea of rules. When Jack and the tribe go to steal Piggy's glasses at the end to take to Castle Rock, they leave the conch but take the glasses. And that's a really important symbol. Golding warns us that civility and order is lost on this island. Okay, when they decide not to take that conch, they decide that rules are no longer important. And then we've got that big quotation with Piggy's death. The conch exploded into 1,000 white fragments and ceased to exist. Okay, when Piggy dies, so does civility. That warlike Lex's destruction implies there's no way back. If something explodes, then it's of ultimate force. Piggy's glasses and fire. Piggy's glasses superficially present him as being different to the rest of the boys. Okay, we get the idea that he's vulnerable and he's an outsider from the start. Piggy's glasses create fire. Fire equals rescue, so Piggy equals hope for this island, but the boys don't see it. Piggy gets his glasses broken, firstly by Jack, and then they're totally stolen. As he loses his sight through the text, his vulnerability increases. There's an irony that fire, so long it's been a symbol of rescue in this text. You know, remember that Ralph says we ought to die before we let the fire out. But it becomes the predator of Ralph in the end chapter. You know, Jack tries to smoke him out and tries to set fire to the island. This can be seen as a metaphor for everything that Ralph knew, breaking down and being replaced with disorder and chaos. Heat as a motif. Put a few quotations there. The water was warmer than blood. The jungle was a bath of heat. The heat hit him. That motif of heat, this increasing tension of civility on the island, okay? The idea of hell on earth becoming a reality. We know that hell links to kind of fire, so we've got that. Painted faces and long hair. Painted faces becomes a metaphor for the change of the characters in Jack's tribe, especially Jack. Look at those two quotations, I think are dead important. The mask compelled them, and Jack planned his new face. Both quotations suggest an almost magical but sinister metamorphosis that takes over Jack. He becomes the monster, and he does it to himself. Long hair on this island suggests a descent into savagery. Remember for me, it's only Piggy's hair that doesn't grow, and that makes him like a bit of a magical figure. It's a metaphor for the fact that he is married to civility, basically, and it's unbreakable. Nothing can turn Piggy savage. The voice in this text is omniscient or all-knowing, okay? And we see evidence of this, and these key things, I think, that's important. The key thing is the way that the choir boys are described as being the creature as they first walk up the beach in chapter 1. The narrator tells us in this quotation that these boys are the beast. The boys never realise this, and therefore the island's taken over by a fear of a snake-like thing. The narrative voice also calls Piggy the fat boy at the start. The narrator is all-knowing and knows that this boy is vulnerable and different, and he's going to be ridiculed. Okay, so the omniscient narrator also describes the skull-like coconuts, foreshadowing that death's going to happen. So the narrator seems to know all things. Okay, so thinking about exam questions, that's an example for an exam paper. So you get one or the other. So it might be explain how Golding presents Simon as being different to the other boys in Lord of the Flies, or explain how Golding presents violence on the island. Okay, so you choose one of those, 45 minutes. Okay, so you might pause this and have a look, but you know, we know that Simon's Christ-like. Okay, so in an island that's hell-like, Golding presents Simon as a tragic Christ-like figure of hope. And I've got me 3 points there. Okay, got me 3 points there. So Golding foreshadows the idea that Simon is going to be a sacrificial victim of the other boys to show his belief of savagery. You know, and I've got these quotations that they call him Batty and strange and stuff. Okay, we know that he goes into the jungle, he makes it Eden-like. Okay. He's like a Christ-like figure, takes the fruit of the trees. And listen, point 3 is about Simon's death. You just need to know that the boys become the beast. It's mob rule. Okay, it's brutal. Anything's possible. They're only children. Look what they turn to. You might think about the pathetic fallacy. You know, the sky breaks open into a thunderstorm when Simon dies, and that's important. If we were talking about violence, I've got that there, and again you might pause it, look at my thesis, what's Golding saying about violence, and there's a few quotations that I discuss here that's really important. Okay, that chant, that motif, it's all monosyllabic words. Okay, suggests the idea of primal. When we chant something, we celebrate what we're doing. They celebrate death, they don't hide it, they celebrate it. We want meat, monosyllabic language. Okay, in that first point, you know, his violence is implied before he does it. He slammed his knife into the tree motif, you know, really important. He's got violence in him, but he won't act on it at the beginning and stuff like that. There's a few quotations that are missed off there that are really important. You know, when Jack says, we'll have rules, when anybody breaks them, Okay, the sense that rules are only important if there's a punishment at the end. He's a sadistic character. That's really important. Okay. Power and conflict poetry then. Listen, really importantly, those power and conflict grids that I've put on Satchel for you, really important in your revision. Okay. They're on Satchel on the VLA. You need to know every poem well enough that you could talk about them. If you learn 3 quotations from each poem, you are on the way there. Okay. Key themes then, nature. Nature's power of the individual is key. Some of those poems show that. Okay, identity. I really like checking out my history, and I think it's a really important one. Okay, and we've got those there. War and conflict is an important one. Exposure. Remember, if we're talking about exposure, Owen and being a soldier, so his message is different. Charge the Light Brigade propaganda poem. Okay, never-ending torment of conflict. PTSD. War photographer remains. Poppies. The idea that conflict lives on within us. So these are the kind of questions that you get in Power and Conflict, section B. So how are ideas about powerful identities presented in the Emigrate and one other poem? If this is my question on Monday, I'd probably choose checking out my history to describe it. Okay, and this would be my essay plan. So in checking out my history, there's a sense that identities are things that are hidden and lost, but when they're found, they're like an epiphany and unbreakable. Whereas conflict and destruction, the Emigrate shows how identities are things which never truly disappear. Okay, remember in the Emigrate that she personifies a city. She says that I comb its hair and my city takes me dancing. Okay, and shining eyes. You've also got that motif of sunlight, the idea that memories don't break. But have a look at that. Listen, in checking out my history, remember he starts with how he's been blinded and bandaged to his own history, and by the end he carves his own identity. Okay, and that's really important. Those italicized stanzas when he talks about his own culture, you've got the sense that he writes in free verse. There's no punctuation. There's a motive of light within all of them. Okay, when he's thinking about what he's been taught, he's in darkness, but then he's in light at the end. Okay, this is another question. How is nature presented in Storm on the Island and one other poem? Okay, Storm on the Island, if you look at this poem here, it starts with loads of caesura at the end, but then it moves into enjambment towards the end. They think they can control the storm at the beginning, and the caesura shows certainty, but then it changes at the end. Listen, this is my point if I was describing it to exposure, okay? And you might have a look at the quotations that I've put in purple for Storm on the Island, red for exposure. That's what a point looks like, okay? Remember, analysis, layer analysis, talk about individual words, what's the writer suggesting? You might pause the video, just take a look at that. Okay. So this is an example from last year. Okay, so that's the end bit of there. Look how it's got writer's intention. Okay, you might have to just go back a couple of seconds because I rushed over the first slide of that, but on the previous slide is the main body. Have a look at what they said. It was about Miles Duchess and Ozymandias last year. Okay, section C, unseen poetry. 24 marks is your first question. Okay, so 30 minutes on your first question, and it'll look something like that. Yours will be 27.1. Okay, so in shoulders, how does the poet present ideas about the importance of protecting and taking care of each other? You know, so you'll look at the poem and do that. Don't be afraid of unseen poetry. Statistically, people tend to do better on unseen. Okay. This is an example from last year, and it's a different poem. It's about scaffolding. It's a poem called Scaffolding. But look what this candidate does on their first unseen question. They start with a thesis, and then they add the 2 clear paragraphs that talks about individual words, that talks about methods, and think about what they symbolise. You might pause and have a look. Okay, and then you do an 8-mark comparison that's 15 minutes. Okay, so you compare your 2 unseen poems. Remember, you've got to talk about methods. I've got a sentence example there. So it'll look something like that with 27.2. Okay, so what are the similarities and or differences between the methods that poets use to present ideas? Okay, and then from last year, this was the candidate who got top band. Okay, this was their 15-minute response. So if you pause this and have a look, so they talk about methods, They mention methods, they talk about the effect of them, so you might pause and have a look. Okay, and that's a real whistle stop through English Lit Paper 2. So in your revision, get that PDF, power and conflict grids, know the quotations. Okay.